My dear friends, good day. I think if you had told an Englishman in the 15th century that his mother tongue would one day become the most spoken language in the world, we still have 1.3 billion speakers, which puts it ahead of Chinese anyway. He would have burst into laughter, I think. Or at least he would have been a little bit puzzled. English is, in the last centuries of the Middle Ages, confined to the British Isles. And even then, it's not the only language. It cohabits with Latin, of course, but also with French, and in some regions with Celtic languages. The islands are home to deeply multilingual societies, but it's a characteristic of the societies of the entire West that they are at least bilingual. The international language par excellence is Latin, the high language, that of the Church, which has taken over the whole of Western society, even if it is only really practiced by the elites. But French is also at least read in many countries, thanks to the influence of the literature written in this language. The other vernacular languages, that is to say the languages that are only spoken locally, such as Italian, Castilian, Middle High German, or others, are, like English, at first mother tongues, and only progressively become, between the Central Middle Ages and the modern era, written and literary languages. And of course these languages develop at the same time as literacy spreads in society. But let's come back to English, which had a good start in the early Middle Ages compared to other local languages. At this time, we do not yet speak English, but rather Old English. The official birth of Old English is dated to the middle of the 5th century, which corresponds to the beginning of the colonization of what was not yet England by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, Germanic peoples. The latter gradually nibbled away at the territories previously occupied by Celts, and occupied at the beginning of the 7th century the east and center of the island as far north as Edinburgh. The territory was then divided into several kingdoms. Old English is thus a language of Germanic origin, enriched in the 8th and 9th centuries by the Scandinavians during the period of Viking invasions. In the 9th century, King Alfred the Great, who reigned between 871 and 899, achieved the unity of most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in southern England, giving rise to the Kingdom of the English. He succeeded in stopping the Vikings by confining them to the north of the country in the Danelaw. And it is from this moment on that the written culture asserts itself in the region. It is Alfred who is at the origin of a movement of writing, of legal codes and translations of various texts. And this production of texts makes the Old English written culture one of the main ones during this period, except for Ireland. And that as well on the legal level and political as well as cultural levels. He probably translated some of the founding texts of Christian culture himself from Latin, even though he admitted that he had the help of clerics. One can note in particular the pastoral rule of Pope Gregory the Great, which gives a spiritual framework to the clergy, or the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, a major philosophical work during the whole medieval period. He probably also translated the first 50 Psalms of the Bible, and in addition to his own translations, he sponsored others, such as Gregory's Dialogues, a history of saints and miracles. He also presided over the drafting of the legal code called Alfred's Code, which includes the laws of his predecessors plus his own. And last but not least, he was responsible for the writing of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the most important historical chronicle in history. The guy didn't fool around. Other translations are from the same period, but were not necessarily directly commissioned by him, like the Ecclesiastical History of the Venerable Bede, the first great history of the British Isles. For this period, as the historian Jean-Philippe Genet has pointed out, this set of vernacular texts is unique in its diversity and its ambition. One can also compare this with the vernacular traditions of the Celts, in particular the Irish, whose culture was particularly rich in the early Middle Ages. If Alfred's initiatives have enjoyed a certain posterity, it's notably thanks to the revival of English monasticism in the 10th century. This revival resulted in the founding or refounding of new monasteries, particularly in the second half of the 10th century. For example, with that of Glastonbury, which according to legend is located in the place of the island of Avalon. These monasteries soon appeared to be the center of a new Anglo-Saxon Latin culture, but the Reformed monks also produced many vernacular texts in the second half of the 10th century and in the early 11th century. The main figure in this regard is Alfred, a monk who composed sermons, commentaries, lives of saints, and who also translated Genesis. Obviously, the objectives of these monks were not quite the same as those of Alfred. Whereas the latter translated or had translated texts of very general scope, our monks mainly composed texts with a practical vocation, especially sermons. But it must be emphasized that these texts were intended as much for clerics as for laymen, meaning people who are not part of the church. The handwritten diffusion of these texts implied the existence of a public of cultivated laymen. In the more strictly literary domain, the major work is the epic poem Beowulf, preserved in a single manuscript copied around the year 1000, which Tolkien studied and which has given rise to hundreds of translations and various adaptations, including cinematographic ones since the beginning of the 19th century. But everything changed with the Norman conquest of 1066 by William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, whether secular or ecclesiastical, is downgraded in favor of a continental aristocracy that speaks French in various forms. Norman, of course, but also Picard, for example. I've done an episode and a little bit about William the Conqueror, so you can go and see it. If you're interested, it will also give you some background. In any case, for what we're interested here, remember that French is imposed in England in the upper echelons. And this particular French, for a long time, was called Anglo-Norman, but nowadays it's called Anglo-French, which replaces Old English in the aristocracy. So beware, Old English is still the mother tongue of the overwhelming majority of the population. And with mixed marriages, it was, as early as the 13th century, if not earlier, the native language of the aristocracy. French soon enough becomes what is called a second language, and indeed, there are traces of treaties for learning French in the later centuries of the Middle Ages. So French gradually becomes the language of part of the administration, even if Latin, of course, remains dominant. Above all, it gradually becomes the language of the law, and it will remain so until the 17th century. French is also the literary language of the lay people. Literature in French developed rapidly in the 12th century, in part because the Plantagenet dynasty, which succeeded the purely Norman dynasty, would encourage it. The earliest romances, so-called because they were written in Romance, that is, in French, came from the entourage of the Plantagenet court. The most spectacular example is Arthurian literature. The Arthurian legend was invented in the 1130s by a genius forger, Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his work titled The History of the Kings of Britain, an absolute bestseller at the time. So certainly, Arthur and Merlin already existed in the Celtic world, but Geoffrey takes them back and transforms them to include them in a coherent history, and he gives them a primordial place. He writes in Latin, but it is very quickly translated into French by a person named Wace in the 1150s. It was even dedicated to the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, the wife of Henry II Plantagenet. This translation circulated on both sides of the Channel and inspired many writers, starting with the famous Chrétien de Troyes. It has largely contributed to the development of Arthurian legend on both sides of the Channel, probably with the help of oral traditions. In the 12th century, there is virtually no new text in English, and it is only in the 13th century, especially in its second half, that new writings begin to appear, first in the religious field. But it is especially in the 14th and even more in the 15th centuries that written English develops, not necessarily at the expense of French, by the way. While for a very long time English historians have proclaimed the triumph of English within a nationalist framework, England still remains a profoundly multilingual society. This development of English is in fact due to several factors. On the one hand, as in the rest of the West, but perhaps a little earlier than elsewhere, the learning of reading and writing develops very strongly, at least in the vernacular. For a long time, medieval societies were considered to be illiterate societies, where only the clerics had a certain culture. This vision has been largely revised over the last 30 years, especially since we now make a distinction between knowing how to read and how to write. It's true that nowadays the two are quite closely linked, but it's not at all the case in the Middle Ages. You can know how to read without knowing how to write, and moreover, we have a lot of people, even if they didn't know how to read themselves, who had texts read to them. So they were very much more accessible than we think today. To take just one example, it is now estimated that in the 15th century, half of Londoners, but not London women, had some rudimentary reading or even writing skills. The elites were, of course, the first to be affected, but these elites expanded, especially from the 13th century on. In addition to the high aristocracy, we will thus find the small and middle nobility, the urban elites, the lawyers, but also the rich peasants and artisans who learn to read, especially in English. And so it's normal they want to have texts in that language. This English, which is now called Middle English, is in any case very different from Old English. It is now a hybrid language, For the lexicon, it is roughly estimated that half of it is of Germanic origin, a quarter of it is of Latin origin, and another quarter is of French origin. But syntax and grammar were also strongly influenced. Many of the works composed at that time were translations and adaptations of Latin, but also significantly, of French. But, contrary to what happened in France at the same time, very few works were commissioned by the monarchy. Indeed, there is nothing comparable to the imposing royal library of the Louvre, constituted notably by King Charles V, who ordered countless translations, which considerably enriched the lexicon to make French a truly learned language. One of the reasons for the English monarchy's deficit in this area is linked to the 100 Years' War, which officially began in 1337, but whose roots go back much further. The English King Edward III and his successors claimed to be King of France, and therefore had to support the French language, even if they sometimes used rhetoric playing on the fear of destruction of the English language. They're a little bit sitting between two chairs. But anyway, more and more is being written in English, and in more and more different fields: devotional and religious, scientific, utilitarian, political, historical, and literary, in the narrowest sense of the word. By the end of the 14th century, several authors were turning English into a refined literary language. The most famous figure is Geoffrey Chaucer, who died in 1400, author of the famous Canterbury Tales, which were even adapted on film by Pasolini. He is a bit like the Dante of the English and is very often considered as the father of English. In addition, still at the end of the 14th century, the most important text for anyone living in the Middle Ages, the Bible, was translated entirely into English. This is the first complete translation of the Bible into a vernacular language. There were partial translations and adaptations, but no undertaking of this magnitude. This translation was also widely distributed, since several hundred manuscripts remain, even though it was of heretical origin. Yes, the translation was driven by a certain John Wycliffe, the originator of the Lollard heresy, which could be likened to proto-Protestants with rejection of the clergy, of the temporal goods of the Church, of the sacrament of the Eucharist, and access for all to the Bible, hence the translation. The heresy was fought throughout the 15th century, but the translation still circulated in all circles. The kings of England owned at least one copy. By the end of the 14th century, however, English had not yet really penetrated the administration. It is only in the 15th century that it will gradually take hold. And still, not everywhere, since Latin is still used for many documents, especially diplomatic ones, and French is still the legal language. We can nevertheless note a turning point with the end of the 100 Years' War in 1453. English then gains ground in all areas of administration, and at the end of the 15th century, under the first Tudor king, Henry VII, the statutes of the kingdom, which are documents with both legislative and strong symbolic significance, are finally written in English. So it is not until the 16th century that English can be said to triumph over French. But not quite over the Latin carried by humanism, even though some very famous humanists, beginning with Thomas More, wrote in both languages. Shakespeare certainly represents today the symbol of the consecration of English, which was then no longer quite middle but beginning to be modern. But even in the 17th century, some such as Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, still complained about the poverty of English in the face of other languages. In the 18th century, English finally earned all its stripes. And it was at this point, intimately linked to colonization and the formation of the British Empire, that English eventually became the world language it is today. Thank you all for following this episode, and thank you to Aude Mairey, historian of medieval England, for accompanying me on this script. Don't forget to subscribe, to share the episode. It's the best support you can give to the channel. See you soon on Nota Bene.